Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. Joining me, Richard Sverrisson, are Merlin Hyman, CEO of Regen, and our own Phil Hewitt. A warm welcome, gentlemen.
Hello, Richard.
Good afternoon, Richard.
So, before we delve into the details of the manifestos and Labour's in particular, let's talk about energy as part of an election issue. Has it been top of the agenda at all, Merlin?
Well, it's definitely been on the agenda, and probably in a more significant way than in the past. I think that the context of the energy price shock after the war in Ukraine, the eye-watering sums of money that British state has had to put in to sort of ameliorate the effects on people of that, and Labour setting a kind of mission of clean power by 2030 has definitely kind of put it on the agenda. I think what's maybe coming up the election, there was a thinking that it might really feature as a major issue, and I think maybe in the campaign it's a bit of the dog that didn't bark, and I think the reason behind that is that it's not really territory the Conservatives want to attack Labour on particularly. You're not in a debate going to get Rishi Sunak taking on Starmer over their clean power plan, because he doesn't really want to talk about that. He wants to talk about tax. So I think it is a significant issue. It's been a big issue before, but it hasn't really featured heavily in the election campaign.
Mm. Would you agree with that, Phil?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think the Conservatives have tried to attack Labour on tax, and at the same time, the Labour Party has been kind of keeping relatively quiet, and the Conservatives seem to have managed to have a few own goals and mistakes in their campaign, which the press have probably found it easier to focus on because it's a lot simpler story than the energy transition.
But would it be fair to say as well, Merlin, that there seems to be an assumption that the UK voters or the UK electorate is sort of anti-green or anti-energy transition? Would you share that view?
No, I don't think there's any evidence for that, and that might be a little bit why the Conservatives haven't really gone full bore in the way that, say, reform have gone, and we might see that post-election. But climate features consistently in the top 5 issues that the public is concerned about. There's some very good work by Public First, and they're a kind of research polling public affairs type company looking at looking in kind of red wall type areas where you might think there might be some resistance, and how people in sort of focus group type work, looking at how people see this is a sort of anti-net zero agenda attractive, and that there is no evidence that plays well with the British public at the moment. And if you look at polling evidence on the support for renewables, it's consistently over 80% in support, and for every technology in every poll there's ever been. So there currently is no evidence. Not to say that couldn't be weaponized as an issue by a populist movement in the future, but it hasn't been so far. And currently, no one looking at the polling evidence is going to conclude that it's a good agenda to sort of go after as a way of getting more popular.
Mm. And there's no appetite for maxing out the oil and gas reserves. Then, would you say, Phil?
No, it just reinforcing what Merlin said. It's about. There's some recent research only 3 days ago by Ipsos Mori that had like 77% support for climate action, but it's not. But only 15% of people are extremely worried. So it's kind of just generally people are worried about it. But then on the reform side, there's definitely very anti what they call the net zero agenda. So they're all about burning and bringing even fracking back, whereas the Conservatives are not keen on fracking, but are keen on still granting further offshore licenses to oil and gas. Whereas the Labour position is to not allow any more licenses, but allow those that have been granted the option to go through to actually production. So it's an interesting. That's kind of the texture. So So is it burn baby burn? Definitely not, unless you're on the far right, where definitely it's seen as a as an issue that people can get their teeth into.
I think that it's perhaps worth saying, Richard, that the UK has been quite rare actually in benefiting from a consensus across the major parties to act on climate, and obviously Boris Johnson made it quite a big part of his personal mandate and approach with COP26, etc. And that kind of continues. Sunak has backed away a bit from the messaging, but not a lot from the kind of level of ambition. And you're not really seeing the Tories go after Labour hard on this issue in the election, really. But that's not to say that couldn't happen in the future. We've seen in other countries, you've seen in Germany recently a backlash over some rules around heat pumps and gas boilers that has been quite a significant part of the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the sort of German far right. And so we are seeing populist movements across Europe starting to weaponize this agenda. You're seeing Reform definitely picking up on that approach, and I think it's highly likely that this consensus in the next Parliament will break down, and that there will be a strong right-wing opposition. There will be a right-wing opposition that is quite challenging about the consensus on climate and net zero, and that will be a very different climate in some ways than having where even when you have the governing party very pro, it's a very different climate to when you have both main parties pro.
Absolutely. I mean, there certainly has always been that kind of agenda. You see it in Italy and also other parts of Europe where the right wing has been anti-wind and anti-solar on agricultural land. That seems, but that's not necessarily just a right-wing position, but it seems to be a common position elsewhere. But let's delve deeply into the Labour manifesto. As it looks, Labour will win the election, whether it's by a landslide or not. It remains to be seen. I think The Economist sort of gave the Conservatives, what was it, 1% chance of winning the election. So I think one can assume that it's going to be Keir in number 10, but Phil, what were the main tenets of the Labour manifesto, the Labour energy policy?
Oh, it's quite interesting. It's that they're certainly focusing on net zero by zero carbon electricity system by 2030. That's a very ambitious goal. Probably unlikely they can meet that, but it's certainly an ambitious goal. But also there's a lot of general growth strategy around it to enable that transition, because if you're active in the energy space in the UK, there's certainly no lack of ambition about decarbonisation. One of the problems is that there's not enough grid capacity, and the planning process takes a very long time to deliver you a project. So Labour is also focusing on planning as changing the planning system to try and open up growth and deployment of renewables. And one of the key differences between them and the Conservatives is allowing onshore wind to come back into the mix, whereas previously the Conservative government has prevented onshore wind. Not prevented it, but made it very easy for campaigners to stop an onshore wind farm.
Basically prevented it.
essentially banned it, but without banning it.
Yeah.
In England. But how do you see it then, Merlin? I mean, to go to net zero or carbon neutral by 2030 is extremely ambitious, as Phil says, and that's if my maths is right, 5.5 years away.
Yeah. So the clean power by 2030 is the terminology.
Okay.
So I think Phil's actually captured that pretty well. Maybe I'll come back to that in a moment. In a way, I think it's less the level of ambition or even the specific policy priorities, which actually are not really that different. I'm not even sure that clean power by 2030 is particularly different to where the Conservatives definitely 2035. But so I'll come back to that. I think it's more about the what you might call the kind of the delivery mechanism, that the machinery of government, the kind of the level of input behind this. I mean, the issues on planning and on grid, are complex, challenging, requiring really, really hard rolled up sleeves work to get fixed. And at the moment, there's just not enough political will behind it all. So what Labour is talking about is, I think, a kind of mission board, some sort of cross-government process that brings together. Because Clean Power 2030 is a mission. It's got 5 missions. That's going to bring that together. I think you might well see some Patrick Vallance, bringing his vaccine task force kind of mentality into this, and invited to chair such a board, and then a real kind of program management kind of vision of what are our problems, what's the planning reform, why is it taking so long, prime ministerial authority. I think Patrick Vallance, who is quoted in the manifesto as saying, we've got to roll up our sleeves and get on with this, and get stuck in kind of language. And in a way, I think that might be in fact, I've got the quote behind me, but I've got the quote behind me, in front of me, from Patrick Vallance in the Labour Party manifesto. National mission for clean power by 2030 is achievable, should be priorities. Britain can lead on this by treating this mission like the vaccine challenge. We can be the innovators and the implementers, etc. So I think the more important thing than any specific policy might be that kind of, this is a prime ministerial driven cross-government mission where we're just going to get any barriers out of the way and roll up our sleeves and get stuck in.
But I think rolling up your sleeves is one thing, isn't it? But actually, are you then just going to ride roughshod over local communities and just, cover the North York moors with wind turbines, Phil? I mean, you live not far from the North Yorkshire moors.
Yeah, some of the language that Kier Starmer has used is things like, we're not afraid to make enemies. So this is very much that they're prepared to roll up their sleeves and, if necessary, steamroller through. So because they believe Merlin, that's required, and that's brave talk.
I mean, there's a new government coming in. They have a kind of political mandate. They've put this out very clearly in their manifesto. They are politically, they are less exposed on this issue than the Conservatives, where the Conservatives have to sort of worry more about their voter base. I'm not sure the Labour. I don't think Labour is so worried about annoying their voter base. If I don't know. They might well take a slightly political view that if East Anglia hasn't voted for them yet, this time it probably never will, and therefore, if we need some more substations, kind of brutal politics. So, yeah, I think they will go down that approach. My own feelings, I hope that they mediate that, if they don't go too far down that road, because I think we've learned over the years that certainly in the UK, if the people don't want something, it's incredibly hard to impose on it. I mean, I remember for years the Treasury had 4 pages in the budget each year about how they were going to frack the hell out of everything. We were chief frackers, we were leading frackers, and no one ever, there's never, it's just never going to happen, because people are just not going to put up with it. And it's very hard in this country, to force something through. So I think they need to really engage people in this transition, rather than, and keep that mentality if we need to engage, explain, involve people. But in the end, a decision will have to be made, and if we need a new grid line in order to open up areas of the offshore wind, then in the end it does have to go somewhere, and that is a national priority. So if they can get that balance right, of builders not the blockers, we put it in our manifesto, we told you we're going to do this and you voted for us, a little bit of political reality along with an effort to really bring people along it, then I think there is a path there for them. I'm just going to come out on this point about clean power by 2030. I mean, they've been very clear that they're still going to have a bunch of gas-fired power stations on tap. So they haven't really defined what clean power means. exactly. If you still got gas, it clearly doesn't mean there's no gas. So what does it mean? If you look at the Committee on Climate Change's kind of balanced pathway, what do we need to hit net zero? We were at 500 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour 10 years ago. We're now an average of about 150. We go down to about 20 is the record low at any one moment. The CCC balanced pathway over an annual average, it would by 2030 would take us to 46, I think, and 10 by 2035. So for me, that's fine. That's what we need to do. And Labour just slightly redefine, what do we mean by clean power? That we mean what the CCC says to achieve net zero. Then we're, it becomes slightly more manageable and believable. Nonetheless, they are going to really have to go some. The current budget in the auction round 6 for the CFD process would buy you about 1/3 of the offshore wind that you need to hit their targets of quadrupling offshore wind by 2030. And that decision lands on their desk pretty much as soon as they come in. Are they going to increase that budget? So we're talking about specifics. It's 1 billion at the moment. They can make it 3 billion. Some crunchy decisions to be made pretty quickly.
Absolutely. And I think perhaps it would be fair to say as well, it's maybe easier to go from 400 to 150 than it is from 150 to 40. I mean, that's when the real difficult decisions have to be made.
I think that's right, particularly maybe in system operation, and there's some big questions there. Can the system run this very diverse, flexible, high renewable system? Can the control room, manage that and keep the lights on efficiently? And I think that's where as we get into a high renewable system, that's where the big intellectual challenge is to reform the way we manage the system. Use all the storage capacity that's coming on, all the smart technology, etc., to manage a very, very different system. And there's definitely some nerves there amongst, I think, about people who are responsible for keeping the lights on.
Absolutely. I mean, would it be fair to say then, Phil, to summarise, I mean, Keir Starmer's been criticised for playing it too safe. Is he doing the same in terms of energy policy? There's nothing very radical or that's going to change things overnight here.
I think it is. It is quite of the parties that's going to be elected. It's the most radical plan. So it is the most radical plan. Maybe the Greens have a more radical plan, but unlikely to get elected. So it's certainly quite radical. It's being steered by Ed Miliband, who is probably pretty well respected, I think, amongst civil servants when he was the previous energy minister in the Gordon Brown government. So I think it's a credible plan, and it's quite ambitious. Some of the funding commitments are being downscaled because the Labour government, the incoming Labour Party government, has said that they might not be able to afford it all because of issues with the state of the public finances. But certainly it's certainly reasonably ambitious. You could be more ambitious, but there's a limit on how ambitious and how quickly you can build out physically in terms of the constraints of grid planning and supply chains.
Yeah, I think my own view on that in clean power, I think they're super ambitious. The goal is exactly whatever it means. Is very ambitious. They've got it as a central mission. I think they'll be going, go, and I think that'll be the challenge to the industry. Will be to kind of keep up or make sure that decisions don't get rushed because go down the wrong pathway because we're just focused on 2030. I think on other aspects of energy, so for example, heat, decarbonising our heat supply, moving to heat pumps rather than gas boilers, you see a much more cautious approach. They are, and that's I think where the money particularly has bitten, because they're not clean power. I'm not sure we really, there's plenty of people who want to invest. We just need to give them the right. We need to give them the right framework to invest. There's plenty of private sector investors out there. want to build clean power. But if you're going to, insulate and put heat pumps in the nation's homes, that's not something that the population can just fund itself. That does need the sort of state to play a significant role, and they've committed another 6.6 billion over the next parliament to doubling the existing planned government incentives to upgrade 5 million homes to cut bills for families, which sounds all good, but it's still a long way away from what you would need if you were genuinely on track for net zero.
Yeah, there are 30 million homes that they have to deal with. So essentially, 5 million is only a sixth.
That's the difficult politics, isn't it? That's the bit that, where you're telling people they can't do things. They've got to, change their homes. No one's suggesting ripping out gas boilers, but that kind of language starts to get talked about. So I think they'll be very ambitious on power. I think they'll be rather go slower on heat.
That's
on heat, exactly.
That's one word that did jump out of the manifesto I saw, which said nobody will be forced to rip out their gas-fired boiler. So they're not at that point yet.
Not yet,
but anyway. They are prepared to force landlords to improve efficiency of homes to meet a minimum energy efficiency standard. So they're prepared to take on some people, but you don't have to rip your gas boiler out.
Fair enough. I mean, what about nuclear, Phil?
I find the language in the different parties around nuclear is quite interesting. So Labour's committed to Hinkley and to Sizewell, but there's nothing in the manifesto about Wilfer. But they're also committed to building a fleet of small modular reactors, whereas the Conservatives are committed to building 2 fleets of small modular reactors. So I found that quite funny.
Quite a big difference.
It depends how big your fleet is and how big your small modular reactor, how small your modular reactor is. But for those who are not familiar with a modular reactor, essentially it's the technology that's been used in nuclear submarines and nuclear aircraft carriers, but essentially bolted to the ground. So the reactors are a lot smaller. And the idea, I think, is with a smaller reactor, you might be able to build a lot of them as opposed to large kind of Flamanville or Hinkley Point C size reactors, which, as we've seen from Hinkley Point C, go over budget, and the delivery timescale goes massively to the right.
But that's largely unproven as well, though. I mean, the SMRs, the technology, fine in submarines, but on land, there's nowhere where it's been built or can actually generated a kilowatt hour of electricity.
Unless it's up by Dounreay, actually, where they developed them. I suppose they actually had to develop the original ones bolted to the ground. But it's there's a couple of companies like Rolls-Royce and Westinghouse who are pushing them hard.
Sure.
And they're very confident. But yes, you're right. I don't know if anybody's actually put an SMR into commercial operation yet. I don't know. Merlin might know different.
No, I mean, the nuclear thing is interesting. Is if you're thinking about 2030, I mean, if we were to go ahead with Sizewell, what's anyone's 2040, 2045?
2040 would be an aggressive timescale. But the experience for 2040, I think, if you think about it, if experience of watching Hinkley Point C limp along, then 2040 is 15 years, but that still seems quite an aggressive timescale.
So it's kind of irrelevant to this, and by the time you've got them, if renewables and short and longer term duration technologies have really come on, then you might be thinking this is rather an expensive white elephant. So, it's sort of, it feels to me like a bit of a distraction. And I'm told by someone that something like half the wage bill of DESNZ goes on people working on the Sizewell project. So that seems nuts to me, I have to say. The SMR thing, I mean, it begins to sound a bit like, sort of the dream that that's going to come one day. I mean, they say small. They're not small, are they? I think they're about 1 gigawatt is the general view. Is it cheap? I mean, generally these kind of big industrial projects benefit from economies of scale. So going smaller and therefore expecting them to be cheaper seems like a counterintuitive conclusion. So yeah, my guess is that nuclear will continue to absorb a lot of airtime, a lot of civil servants, but be pretty irrelevant to the future of the UK's energy system.
So DESNZ, that's the beast formerly known as BASE, is it? So BEIS.
Yeah, which was formerly known as DEC, which
Yeah.
was formerly known as
DTI or whatever.
the Energy Department.
Yeah. So what's it going to be in the next Labour government then, or the potential next Labour government, Phil?
I don't know. That's up for Ed Miliband to decide, but I doubt it'll be DESNZ. I don't know. Will it go back to DEC or I don't know.
What was it under Gordon Brown? DEC?
Yeah, it was. It was DEC. Yeah.
It was DEC. Yeah, I'm not sure whether we've said nothing about Labour moving the deck chairs around in the Titanic in terms of departmental names, have we? And it's a tempting thing for politicians to do, because you're trying to make things happen and you sort of pull on policy levers, and then the real world doesn't seem to change very much. But you can
change the name.
You can change the name on top of something, and you can move civil servants' desk around, so you can think, oh, I've actually done something there. So it's quite
change logos, and
I'm
stuff.
not sure it really makes it a huge amount of difference. I suspect they might leave the departments alone and focus instead on this kind of cross-governmental mission stuff, and they've got Sue Gray, who was a leading civil servant, and most people have probably heard of in context of the parties at Downing Street inquiry, who's a sort of expert in fixer in government, and I think rather than moving departments, I think they'll focus on those kind of cross-government mission board type structures.
And I think one of the impressions you get from talking to from reading around the various profiles and various documents on Kier Starmer, he does appear to be a pretty good manager. So yeah. I don't think changing the name on the front door really matters. It's more around getting people working together effectively. What do you hope anyway?
I mean, absolutely. I'd just like to, we could talk for hours on this, but in the interest of time, we have to draw things a bit to a close. But if I can talk about the relationship with the EU and in CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in particular, Phil, is there any mention of that in the manifesto? What are your expectations there?
So in the Labour manifesto, they do mention a CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, but they don't mention if it applies to electricity or not. So the current UK position is it doesn't apply to electricity, but obviously the European Union CBAM does apply to electricity. That might be an interesting debate, and something that that the Conservative opposition, if it is big enough to be the opposition, some polls are suggesting it might not even get that big. That would use the potential of the potential renegotiation or window for renegotiating the trade and cooperation agreement, which starts in 2025, because it's only a 5-year agreement that was signed on the 1st of January 2021. So there is a window for renegotiation. But to quote Monsieur Barnier, it won't just be about energy; it'll be about everything. So certainly the current interconnector arrangements aren't efficient. There's worries about CBAM. There's a need for the countries around the North Sea to cooperate on offshore wind and to be able to share power and share interconnection. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be clarified, and then to an extent was written down as a wish list in the TCA that was signed at the end of Brexit, but wasn't actually delivered on at all. So maybe that'll be reopened, and then there is a point at which having efficient interconnected trading, when you've got a country like GB in 5 years' time, clean power by 2030, might be looking for a route to dump all its excess offshore wind somewhere. Then it might be in the interest of the European Union to start reopening that to make interconnected trading more efficient. And maybe that, if that happens in 25, 26, I think there might be a lot of political jumping up and down and calls of betrayal over Brexit. But But yeah, it'll be interesting. But that has to be that there is an opportunity to renegotiate that, and whether that impacts on the energy relationship between Europe and between the EU and the United Kingdom is. We'll see. It might be tied up with other things such as free movement and security.
Any thoughts, Merlin?
I was up recently at the Global Offshore Wind Conference in Manchester with Ed Mellon. Listened to Ed Mellon speak very passionately, in fact, about this agenda and offshore wind more generally, and a lot of the kind of when various panels across the 2 days talk when people asked about their kind of wish list. A lot of them brought up better relationships with Europe, and particularly specifically precisely because of the points Phil's made about interconnectors and optimizing across them. And I think there is a really big prize there. I mean, if we're gonna, it just makes a lot of sense. We are physically interconnected quite extensively with Europe already. The way the interconnections work is not optimized, doesn't make a lot of sense. As we build out North Sea and we get sort of North Sea grids coming out from Europe, the UK interconnecting into those makes a lot of sense. And this whole process is going to be a lot easier and a lot more logical if we do it as part of a European approach. So I think there's a lot there. Any of these sorts of negotiations are always hideously complicated, but I'm a bit more positive about the fact that quite a lot of people in Europe, will now want, are over some of the shock and would like to rebuild positive relationships with the UK in certain areas. Energy seems like quite a good area to do that. It's quite technocratic, and so is anyone really going to? It's sort of like, oh yeah, okay, we're sorting out the energy stuff. It doesn't feel quite as personal, some sort of free movement and the like. So I think they might be able to hive it off a little bit and go, it's just a sensible technocratic bit of kind of policy adjustment over here. Nothing to see too much. So yeah, and it seems to fit well with Labour's like pragmatic. We want to work better with Europe. So really important area, and I think there is a window of opportunity, but I don't underestimate the complexities of any of these kind of these negotiations.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we have to draw a line on the discussion there, but fascinating to hear your views on what we can expect from what looks like very certainly a Labour government, and maybe not even the Conservatives in opposition. That's quite a thought there, Phil. But gentlemen, thank you very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Cheers.